Hi, everyone. Oh, this is epic. Thank you, everyone. So I'm QZ, as Romina managed to introduce me, and I come from Singapore. Um, I'm here for the first time in Honduras, and I'm very excited. And it is surprisingly the same temperature as Singapore, so I feel very much at home. Uh, I don't sweat that much, so that's great. So today I'm going to be talking about ecosystem building, and the way that I'm going to approach this presentation is to try and communicate to you what are some of the behind the scenes thinking when it comes from an ecosystem builder's perspective. So, 101, 10 ideas in 10 topics, and one call to action. So I've been told that I can go over time, so I'm going to try not to, but there's a good chance that I might, because I have so many stories of growing ecosystems, not only in Singapore, but in Southeast Asia. Now, I think most of you will know that DevCon is coming to Thailand this year, and I really hope that you will take the chance to fly down to Southeast Asia and to meet the rest of the community here. The reason is quite simple, actually. The LATAM community and Southeast Asia have actually a very similar heritage and very similar culture. And I think when you arrive, you will be able to feel it for yourself. For us, I think Ethereum, crypto, Web3 isn't something that we simply want or that we play with. There is a potential to change entire societies, to transform our lives. And so it is our responsibility to grow meaningful and well-run ecosystems. So we're going to start with the first thing, which is I'd like you to consider two modalities of ecosystems. So the first is that most ecosystems tend to be organic or they are designed. And the key difference, in my opinion, is that organic ecosystems tend to achieve stability through competition, while design ecosystems do it through coordination. Now, also, you can see the slides. There's the Spanish version of it. I'd like to apologize in advance if I got it wrong. My good friend ChatGPT helped me with it. So if there's anything wrong, please let me know. But I've designed the slides in a way that if you see any particular sentence that you resonate with or you feel with, feel free to take a photo. Feel free to tag me to continue the conversation, because there is really a lot to unpack. I don't think I can go through all 101 statements in the 30 minutes that I have, but hopefully when you look at it, you can think a little deeper about what's going on around you, what's going on in the year, what's going on in the Ethereum ecosystem. Right? Today is a big day. The Denkun upgrade just happened. This didn't happen by chance. It took an entire ecosystem. So let's start. First, I think when I mention the word competition, there is a kind of like a bad connotation, but I want to let you know that competition isn't necessarily bad. If it is balanced and fair, it can be very healthy competition. However, once competition becomes toxic, it becomes a lose-lose situation for the entire ecosystem. And in my opinion, I think the most important way to preserve that is something called intellectual honesty, which is if different community leaders are honest about what they can and cannot do for their communities, you get healthy competition. So I think you notice that there are many different communities that interact, that play together, that sometimes even compete. But as long as we work towards a brighter future, I think it's going to work out for everyone. Next, I think for us as a Singaporean, when I'm born, I walk right into a designed ecosystem. My education system is designed by systems engineers. It's amazing. And it's interesting because what happens is that now you have the potential for positive feedback loops. And when communities start to play towards these different positive feedback loops, you get something unique, and every community gets to stand out in its own way. And I want to encourage you to find that particular thing that helps your community stand out. It might be students, it might be education communities, it might even be NFT communities, right? Like I was talking to the Miladies, you have the Bored Apes, all these different people have very unique perspective, very unique starting points. Now the problem with design ecosystems is that because the creator's hand is very prominent in any particular ecosystem, the creator's biases will also be the weakness of these ecosystems. And so therefore, both organic and design ecosystems are actually two sides of the same coin. A balance of conflict and coordination is what keeps an entire ecosystem alive. And to be able to play on both modalities is most important. Now, I'd like to mention one thing that is quite important and is quite salient when it comes to different community builders and ecosystem builders. But we have to be humble because power over any ecosystem is merely an illusion. It does not exist, right? For us, legitimacy is the scarcest resource. It can be built and destroyed in absolute moments, but that is what makes our ecosystems unique and it's what helps us thrive. So those are the first 10 ideas. Let's move on to the next. Now, I mentioned a bit about conflict, right? And I think this is quite important. And I wanted to spend some time talking about it because I think most of you will interact with the crypto ecosystem through Twitter. And Twitter is like 24/7 conflict, right? Everyone is just fighting nonstop. It's frustrating. But let's think a little deeper, and hopefully you can have some takeaways from this. Now, the first thing I hope that you understand is that not all conflict can be resolved, but we can learn to move on, right? We can learn to just make peace with each other and move on and get back with our lives. However, some conflicts actually resolve themselves, and non-action is actually harder than action. Now, how do you know when that happens? I think once you understand that conflict is inevitable, even if you try and prevent it, it's okay to have that wisdom to know when to step back and to see when different communities have disagreements, how to manage them. And in the end, I think both communities or the entire ecosystem can come up on top. Now, here's a phrase that I'm going to reflect a bit from Bruce Lee, which is that it is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war, right? Which means that even though you might not enjoy or you might not thrive in conflict, you need to know how to manage it because it's going to happen, right? You don't want to be caught in one when you're not ready, especially when it comes to communities and livelihoods and reputations are at stake. Here's one thing that's unique, and I'd like to encourage you to grow that perspective. But the thing is, bystanders have the clearest perspective, but are also least invested in solving the conflict, right? When you're on Twitter and you see two different communities fighting it out, you know for sure, actually, it's very clear the way it is communicated, the facts. But you're not going to dive into the comments, right? It's kind of meaningless. So there's this strange paradox that I think we could maybe highlight for a bit. Another point is that sometimes it's best that you try not to get personally involved in any conflict. But if you do stick to the facts. Because in the end, once mudslinging happens, everyone ends up dirty. So the best way to get out of a conflict is to not get into one in the first place. Now, I think most of you are new in the ecosystem. You probably wouldn't know how to navigate the complexities of it. Different communities, different interactions might seem very new and very fresh to you. So I think it's best to just keep an open mind and just keep learning. Occasionally, you might have the privilege of mediating a conflict. And when that happens, especially in communities, one thing will remain is that people will always remember how you managed it. And so it's key to stick to principles, right? And two principles I think work best, especially from an ecosystem perspective. One is justice and one is meritocracy. As long as you keep these two things in mind to help mediate the situation, generally things will go out quite well. But most importantly, in a community, second chances are really important. Rehabilitation is really good. If you are leading an ecosystem and you can rehabilitate different communities, taking the role of an educator is generally the best way of doing this. And lastly, of course, an apology goes a very long way, something that I've learned many times personally. Now, let's talk about coordination, right? Now that we've gotten that out of the way. I think it's interesting because in Ethereum, you hear a lot about coordination as a principle or almost as a way of life. And so I'd like to share a bit about some different ways of coordinating and when it's a good time to coordinate. So the first one is that when the sum of a whole is greater than its parts, coordination is naturally encouraged. And that's why events like ETH is perfect, because the entire community coming together, coordinating, is so much stronger together than apart. And it brings people like myself all the way to Honduras to come and take part in these community activities. That's why events like DEF CON is pretty important, but it's just the very beginning, right? The key principle is that the right to coordinate, right? The people that put this together is based on trust and reputation. That gives them the ability to negotiate. And when you start these different negotiations, it's very different. I remember when I first learned the principles of coordination, people recommended this book or a podcast by an ex-FBI hostage negotiator. And basically his entire principle was to never split the difference, right? To always negotiate very hard and to kind of like dominate the hijacker or whatever, right? That only works in hostage situations, right? In communities, always split the difference. It's a long game. It's an infinite game. Now, the last piece, I think, that helps grow that trust and that reputation, as each and one of you start to participate in ecosystems, is that you cannot command an ecosystem. So I noticed there's some people in uniform here. But I think there is an interesting principle here that might help you understand Ethereum ecosystems a little better, which is that you have to lead without authority. And to do that is extremely difficult. It takes time, it takes iteration. So the best way is to start small, right? Volunteer, be a part of the ecosystem, talk to different people, contribute code, join community calls. Starting early and involving all the relevant parties lays the perfect foundation for you to take part in ecosystems and to be a part of different communities. But the best part is this, right? An ecosystem is not a company. There is no hierarchy in an ecosystem, which means that you are only limited by how much you want to contribute, by how much you want to help. That is incredible, and that's why Ethereum can grow so quickly and still remain accessible to so many of us. Now, when it comes to coordination, I think one thing that you will realize is that conversations can only go so far, and that nothing actually beats working together. So when you start participating in different activities, when you join a boot camp, when you learn how to code, when you join the Build Guild, all these different ways are actually you taking part in coordination. You are learning by doing. In any ecosystem, once that starts, communication is really the lifeblood that keeps any ecosystem going. And culture is the unspoken language of an ecosystem. Culture is something that comes to us naturally. It is something that you learn once you're young, when you're in school, when you grow up, in every little interaction. Culture tells you what is important, what to look out for, and the little unspoken things that happen in every small interaction that you have. That is the unspoken language of any and every ecosystem, and that's what us ecosystem builders do our best to preserve or to promote. Now, in the LATAM community, I think some of you have been involved in governance in very big, prominent DAOs like Arbitrum or Optimism. I think it's absolutely incredible, and there are some simple governance principles. And the first one is that governance is a duty and a responsibility. Governance is so much more than simply allocating resources. You need to sustain these different resources. And the mere act of voting doesn't make a system democratic automatically, right? I think a lot of us, want to participate in democratic governance, but sadly, this might come across as a bit controversial, but all voices should be heard, but not all voices necessarily need to have a say. And the reason for that is context, right? The ecosystem has been around for maybe 10 years by now, like the Ethereum ecosystem. But Ethereum as an ecosystem is part of a much bigger, decade-long movement, the open source movement, the cypherpunk movement, right? These different things require a high amount of context. And even though, you might want to have a voice, sometimes, people that have a bit more context is better empowered to make some decisions. Now, when it comes to governance, I think something really important is to build a mechanism for renewal. That's something that I'm still working on, that I'm still learning, because talent is really the lifeblood of any ecosystem, and putting talent to the right governance roles is how you keep the entire ecosystem alive and well-governed, and to sustain your different ecosystems' resources. Sometimes you are tempted to change your governance system, right? But really changing the system doesn't necessarily mean that you will get different outcomes. And so it is important to not over-engineer your governance processes and really to just get started. Because ultimately, it is about human relationships which necessitates different politics. And one key principle that I hope that when you, as community members, give your attention and give your time to realize one thing, it's that people who crave power are usually least fit to have it. And you will notice that in crypto, that happens a lot. There are people that want the clout, they want to be big influencers, they want to be KOLs, right? They're just shilling, right? So be very careful who you give your prized, super important time and attention to. Now, if you ever have the privilege of being in a role for governance, I think it's most important to optimize for stability because we are in a very chaotic ecosystem, and therefore, stability gives you the capacity to react to chaos. And that is why the Ethereum ecosystem has lasted so long. Because as an ecosystem, we optimize for stability. I mean, you hear the core devs, you hear the researchers talk about trying to ossify parts of Ethereum. That's great, because then you have clarity about how we can coordinate together and how competition can be kept healthy. And these are 10 very simple key principles of governance. Next, let's talk about the people that actually run this governance, the stewards. Stewardship, once again, is so much more than just managing resources. In community ecosystems, the most important thing to preserve is a healthy culture. And to do that requires the right people to be given power. And now you know what kinds of people deserve it, right? So once you're a steward and you're starting to run different community events, there's something that you need to notice, which is that when you start doing things right, consistency actually builds expectation. So be very careful, right, what you want to do repeatedly. It's very common for you that when you join a DAO or you join a Discord, right, people are like, oh, let's do a call every 2 weeks, right? Oh man, after 6 months of 2-week calls, it's like 12 calls. By the 15th call, you're just like, what are we even talking about, right? And then the community starts to lose that energy, right? It gets sapped out. So be very careful what you commit to, because as a steward, you set the direction of community activities, of community time, of community attention. Now, as a steward, this is particularly important. Public communication will be scrutinized. And so it's very important to be careful. There's been many times that I thought of like restarting Twitter, right, because of like my younger self. Really, public communication is so important because in such a hyper-connected social ecosystem, sometimes media picks you up. Sometimes, irresponsible language comes off as abrasive or comes off as confusing, and it makes it even more difficult for people to enter and contribute into the ecosystem. Now, one example, I'm not sure if you've been around for this, but remember, I think last year, sometime in August, Twitter was all crazy about this thing where wrapped ETH was about to depack from ETH. Do you remember this thing? I'm not sure if you've heard of it. Now, if you did, right, it's complete nonsense. It's impossible for wrapped ETH to depack from ETH. And for me, it was extremely crazy because I would see KOLs with people that have like 100,000 followers retweeting and memeing this thing and scaring new people in the ecosystem that, oh wow, wrapped ETH is going to depack. That's completely bad and extremely irresponsible. And so that is not fitting of a community steward. Next. Now, as a steward, something that you will realize is that you will face difficult decisions constantly. And because we're such a hyper-connected ecosystem, this particularly comes about when friendships and suitability collide. It's just a matter of time before you end up working with your friends here. I can almost guarantee it. But sometimes, your friend is not the right fit. So what do you do? That's not easy, but that's for you to find out. Now, as a steward, you do need to think about time and perspective. And one thing is that large ecosystems, right? Now, the LATAM community is pretty big, but Ethereum as a gigantic community is way bigger. It's like magnitudes bigger. It takes time to adjust to changes, so do factor that in. That's why if you want to go to DEF CON, for example, if you want to think about what ETH LATAM is going to be next year, you should start thinking 2 years before, right? think about what are the little steps that you can do to bring talent, to bring attention, to bring time, to bring energy, to make sure that the entire ecosystem can collaborate and coordinate together. But here's a small paradox, which is that as a steward, you do want the best for your ecosystem, right? You want everybody to succeed, you want everybody to be happy. But sometimes, you do need to let mistakes happen. Sometimes again, multiple times, so that people do learn for themselves. If you've been in the ecosystem, if you've been in the crypto ecosystem especially for multiple cycles, right? If you learn about the history of Bitcoin all the way to Ethereum, you'll find that the entire thing is very poetic. There are things that has happened before, that's happening again, and well, sometimes you just got to let it happen, and you just got to let people learn it for themselves. But as a steward, what you can do is to maintain the right culture and to maintain the safe space to welcome people back once these lessons are learned, and ideally keep for the rest of their time in the ecosystem. Now, back to resource management, right? Sometimes you'll be organizing events. Some of you will do meetups. Some of you will do hacker houses even, right? One thing that I learned when doing Ethereum Singapore is that it is much easier to spend than to save, and that everything looks good when proposing a budget. I remember I had a Singaporean indie songwriter, so shout out to Inch if you see this. But she wrote a song for Ethereum Singapore and it was absolutely beautiful, right? So I go to my production company and I'm like, okay, can she perform for me? And they're like, sure, it's going to cost you 5,000. Oh, okay. Wow. Well, it's easier to spend than to save. That 5,000 was pretty worth it for a 3-minute performance. But I think that's something to think about from the perspective of a steward. Now, the other piece is that everything does require context and timing. So going back to that analogy of the indie musician that wrote a song, right? What is the context here, right? I wanted the world to see that Singapore is different. Like, we're not all like super rigid, super hardworking, very studious, good at math. We want to show that we are artistic too. And so it was the right timing because she was doing the opening song, and this was the first impression that people will have. And so, hey, it seemed to be a right decision at the time. But doesn't mean that you should just keep letting people perform, yeah, by the way. So the last piece as a steward, and this is actually goes out to the community organizers here. I'm not calling anything out, but also for myself to learn this, but that as a steward, our work isn't done until a new generation has taken over and made their mark. Only then is our responsibility done, and we can, finally take a break, maybe go diving in Roatan or something. So, as a steward, it's an incredibly important responsibility. And if anything, I hope these 10 points will help you to appreciate the stewards that have helped to run ETH Latam for some time, and the overall Ethereum ecosystem, and that hopefully some of you will be inspired to take on this role eventually, so that, they can eventually step down. Now, the last piece is this. Sorry, I'm halfway done, by the way. So the next piece is, how do you feel the pulse of an ecosystem? How do you understand what keeps an ecosystem alive, and what is the health of an ecosystem? Now, the first piece is this. Conflict is inevitable. I already mentioned it, right? Keeping the pulse of an ecosystem close helps you to preempt these different flashpoints and prevents irrevocable damage, things that takes years to resolve, right? And therefore, like the human body, like regular checkups are very important, right? You do one a year, maybe one every 2 years. Check your blood pressure, you want to check your blood glucose, whatever, right? That helps you preempt things and makes you better prepared for the future. Now, one thing to realize is that I think it's very easy to realize that Web3 or crypto or Ethereum is really an echo chamber. And sometimes it's important to remember that your ecosystem is not alone. You need to know what others are doing. You need to know what Web2 is doing, right? I've had so many conversations about what America is doing, what the ETF is going to be, what all these different things, regulation, what the Bitcoiners are doing, what the OG Bitcoiners, what the new Bitcoiners, what are ordinals. All these different things are important because ecosystems interface with each other. Talent moves in between ecosystems, and so it's important for you to know this. But now that I've said so much, it's important to not over-optimize for data points. Because it's so tempting to be like, oh, how many tweets? am I having? How many likes do I have? How many retweets do I have? How many people are in Discord? No, just if you over-optimize for this, you're going to just chase for the wrong things. And I'm going to take a quote from one of my favorite people in the space. A year ago, I think Aya Miyaguchi from Ethereum Foundation mentioned this, but it's important for you to learn to read the air in the room, to walk into a space and to feel the vibe, to understand how people are reacting. If people are new, if people are OGs, if you've been in the space for some time, how is the ecosystem changing and growing? Well, I'm glad so far it's felt absolutely amazing. Now, in an ecosystem, it's sometimes really difficult for people to express their frustrations, right? And all these little things are expressed in little things, right? Like the occasional snarky comment on Twitter, your Discord is more quiet, you get less GMs maybe, I don't know. Like these little things, right? They are a good sense of how your ecosystem is performing. And actually, KOLs are surprisingly good at understanding the state of any ecosystem. I suppose it's their job. They need to know what's hot, what people are interested in. And so sometimes listening or to interact with them, and most of them are actually surprisingly very open to interact with, can give you a sense of what the ecosystem is really feeling. What are people really doing? But most importantly, don't forget, in any large ecosystem, everything follows a normal distribution, right? It's just statistics. And so my experience is different from yours. Your experience are different from other people. And remember that sometimes when you're kind of like in charge or running like a community event or an ecosystem, right? You can maybe have control over 60% of people's experiences. The other 20% is out of your control. If the ecosystem has a healthy culture, it will take care of itself. Now, the previous presenter talked about grants. Now, I have a different perspective on this. I think grants are actually a surprisingly good way to map out your ecosystem, and QF is a good source of signal. Why? Well, actually, it's very simple. What are grants, essentially, right? You're kind of just taking the chance to give out money to good talent. And, well, if there's money, people are going to come and get it, right? And so the incentive flips. The ecosystem now wants to come to you. And so, actually, I encourage every ecosystem to have a grant program. It helps to encourage new builders, and it helps you to keep a strong pulse on what people are working on. That's why when you look at events like Road to DEF CON, right? I think 2 years ago when DEF CON Bogota was happening, you could see, right, there is so many new nascent ecosystems that start to grow and start to come about, things that wouldn't have been possible if there wasn't like a Road to DEF CON grant to help to coordinate everybody. And look at it now, right? The whole ecosystem is mapped out, people know each other, people work together. So that's something to think about. However, the last point here is that what gets measured gets done, but also ceases to be a good indicator once people start to game it. Humans are like this, right? When there's a target, you just want to hit it. And at some point, the target ceases to be a good target, right? And so that goes into stewardship, it goes into good governance to ensure that the target keeps going and to push the ecosystem forward. Now, I'm going to take some time to talk about what are the pitfalls of running an ecosystem, and hopefully you will be able to see these different pitfalls and then try and avoid them as you go, right? I imagine this is a very long journey, the start of the journey in Ethereum. And the first one is this: ecosystems don't start united, and they don't stay that way without effort. It is every single day. My Telegram blowing up, right? Like what's happening in different communities, all of this takes effort, and it is the gargantuan effort of your stewards that keep it together. The second point is kind of like a call-out. An airdrop does not make an ecosystem, right? Some of you will get it. You'll be called to do governance. You will feel like you're part of an ecosystem, but it's not, right? An airdrop is just, I don't know, man. It's just incentive, maybe. It really depends on what the design of the airdrop is, but just being a part of an airdrop does not make you a part of the ecosystem, and it's important to understand it. If you ever have the opportunity to run a community, do not just rely on that, right? You will see this play out in real time in the subsequent few months, right? This is going to happen continuously. There'll be a lot to learn from that. Now, oh, it seems that I have gotten it in Spanish by accident. So now, for an ecosystem, when you've been in multiple years of being a part of an ecosystem, I think what you will realize is that what happened the last time doesn't always repeat itself, but when it does, it's with different players. So every single time, it's actually unique, right? So for us, when you see a project like Luna, right, it's not the first time we've seen it. We've had a very similar kind of thing situation happen before with like Basis Cash back in like 2016 or something, but the players are completely, entirely different. And so that's something that we as ecosystem leaders need to be able to recontextualize for the community that we have of today. The other thing is that I'm also starting to learn this, but it's important to not overextend your team. If you run too many events, people will get tired, and therefore it is important to remain very strategic when you are being a part of a community and you're doing different activities. The last two pitfalls, I think it's something that takes a lot of energy for us, but it really goes a long way. The first one is that it is very important to resist the temptation to criticize publicly unless it is effective or urgent, right? If there's really a super irresponsible like security situation, I think it's okay. But if it's an opinion, just let it be, keep the peace. And the last bit is this. Try not to spend too much time on Twitter. I have the same problem. I think there are apps for this. But if you're constantly on Twitter, it's very hard to do any actual work. Now, let's talk about sustaining ecosystems, right? And I mentioned this briefly earlier, and I think the LATAM community is doing this very well, which is that without talent, an entire ecosystem is like a desert. Like tending a garden, that's how you do it. Consistency is key. When you start to grow an ecosystem, right, grants are temporary. A lot of these projects, you start with like sponsorships, you start with grants, but ultimately you need to figure out what is the real value that you bring for, that people will pay for. Because an ecosystem needs to be able to sustain itself, and to do that, you need to be honest with your finances. Oh, so when you're running ecosystems, when you're doing projects and initiatives, it's important to not overcommit and underdeliver. It kind of breaks the trust and reputation of any particular ecosystem. And to do that, to extend your capability and your potential and capacity, sometimes it's good to work with different ecosystems, and we're doing that, like between the Southeast Asian community and the LATAM community, to hopefully be able to enhance our activities without needing to grow additional resources. And then from there, once you test the water, you can figure out what to do. Now, time is never enough, right? I'm actually out of time, but time is literally never enough. It's very important to direct it wisely. Otherwise, what happens is that your community members end up running out of energy, and it's a really difficult situation to bring back. And so, as a steward, right, to sustain an ecosystem, it's important to keep things positive and forward-looking. This helps to extend the confidence of any particular ecosystem, and that's why you see at Ethereum, right, you see there's stateful works, always putting on art and culture to encourage the core devs. Because the minute you finish one hard fork, the next one begins, right? Work is never ending. And so to be able to extend that energy is absolutely important. Lastly, ask for help when you need it and be pragmatic. This is more for you, contributor management, and this is kind of like a call to action for everyone. But the first thing is, as a steward, as a community leader, we need to internalize that the community doesn't belong to you. You are your own man, right? And contributors cannot be an afterthought. They have to be at the forefront of everything that you do. Because community goodwill is good, but actually very limited, and therefore it's important to always show gratitude, right? And interact directly with all your individual contributors if possible. Because a volunteer today could be a leader tomorrow. So many of us started out in the ecosystem volunteering as part of events. Volunteering to teach, volunteer to take notes, volunteer to take minutes. Eventually, we move up the value chain, right? And therefore, us as leaders, we are responsible for our contributors because we want to keep them in the ecosystem. We want to keep them constantly playing with us in this infinite game. Now, some attrition is expected, it's okay. Generally, we expect about 20 or 30% attrition. That is absolutely normal, and so we tend to factor that in. And that's why a little training goes a long way. And I like to encourage that when such opportunities occur, like if you want to be trained to do volunteer management, if you want to be trained to stake, if you want to train to be a dev, go for it. This is how you get started in Ethereum. This is how you start contributing to this wonderful ecosystem we call home. And most importantly, keep it fun. Now, the last 10 points is something that holds very dear to the Ethereum ecosystem, and it's very hard to explain, but it's really the philosophy of subtraction. And really, the first key part is that knowing what is essential is just as important as what to do, and that you cannot growth hack a community sustainably. Like, these 2 points are absolutely most important. Do not try and do everything yourself. It creates a dependency, and constant evaluation of what is most essential for each player in the ecosystem is necessary. Because everything has a tendency to accumulate and grow bigger. So balancing between supporting projects and initiatives and letting them figure themselves out is very difficult, and that is really the core of subtraction. In an ecosystem, it is important to never let entitlement creep in. Sometimes it's very easy as a community to expect your leaders to do things for you. That is very difficult. And, well, when it comes to subtraction from a practical perspective, it doesn't mean to limit growth, though. It just means to encourage purposeful action, right? It doesn't mean that, oh, I must have a Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, Discord, everything, right? Just do what is most essential, and you'll be fine. Now, the last 2 things is something that you will find very difficult in a bull market, or in any market or whatever, but sometimes it's okay to respectfully reject unnecessary responsibilities. I find it hard, but it really helps you. And if anything, now you can say, I'm just practicing subtraction, right? Because to be able to see the future repercussions of your actions, that is how you can decide the effects of today's actions, and that is how a community sustains itself. And so, my very last point, let us grow the infinite garden together, and I really hope to see you at Ethereum Singapore, or in Thailand for DevCon Southeast Asia. I'm QZ, that's my Twitter, and I hope to see you around. Take care.